I like it because I know one thing for certain is that if you do get married, you must commit yourself to that.
For 30 years, audiences believed they had watched a flawless piece of cinema. Then film historians, working frame by frame through archival prints, found something that changes how an entire generation will watch the movie's most famous scene again. Forrest Gump premiered in the summer of 1994, directed by Robert Zemeckis and adapted by screenwriter Eric Roth from Winston Groom's 1986 novel. It went on to win 6 Academy Awards, including Best Picture and Best Actor for Tom Hanks, and it became one of the defining American films of its decade. Audiences fell in love with its gentle wandering hero, a man who stumbled into history without ever seeking it, crossing paths with presidents, war, protest, and heartbreak while somehow remaining untouched by cynicism. The film's technical achievement was just as celebrated as its emotional core. Visual effects supervisor Ken Ralston and his team pioneered a method of digitally inserting Tom Hanks into real archival footage, placing him beside John F. Kennedy, Lyndon B. Johnson, and Richard Nixon with a seamlessness that stunned audiences in an era before digital compositing was common. It felt, at the time, like magic without a seam. But magic, especially analog magic built under deadline pressure in the early 1990s, is rarely perfect. And it is precisely because Forrest Gump was constructed with such painstaking craftsmanship that its rare imperfections carry weight. They are not sloppy mistakes. They are the fingerprints of human beings racing against a release date, stitching together decades of American history inside a 2-hour and 22-minute runtime. The error that has resurfaced in recent years, catalogued across film trivia databases and dissected by entertainment outlets like Screen Rant and Blooper, involves one of the film's most emotionally charged sequences, the scene at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C., where Forrest searches the black granite wall for Bubba's name. It is a moment meant to sit entirely inside the film's mid-1980s timeline, a quiet pocket of grief carved into stone. Yet observers who slowed the footage down noticed something the wall itself gave away. Because the memorial's polished granite surface acts as a mirror, it reflects everything standing in front of it, including the people, vehicles, and surroundings present the day filming actually took place. Since the production shot on location at the real memorial in the early 1990s, rather than recreating it on a soundstage, the reflection in the stone captures details that do not belong to the story's supposed decade. It is a small, almost invisible collision between the fictional past the film is asking you to believe in and the real present the camera could not help but record. This kind of error has a name among film historians, an anachronistic reflection, a mistake born not from carelessness but from the impossible tension between authenticity and fiction. Zemeckis wanted the emotional truth of a real memorial, with its real weight and real names, rather than a studio replica that might have felt hollow. That choice gave the scene its power. It also made a certain kind of error unavoidable, because reality does not know it is supposed to be pretending. The ping-pong sequence carries a similar story, though this one has been discussed more openly over the years by those involved in making the film. Tom Hanks did not become a real table tennis prodigy for the role. Instead, the production filmed real competitive players performing the rallies, then used editing and effects work to place Hanks's face and movements convincingly into the action. Watch closely across multiple cuts within the same rally, and the grip on the paddle occasionally shifts in ways that do not match a continuous, unbroken performance. It is not a mistake anyone was meant to see. It is the visible seam of 2 different bodies being stitched into one performance, a magic trick performed so well that it took decades and frame-by-frame scrutiny for casual viewers to notice the stitching at all. There is something quietly moving about the fact that these errors have taken this long to surface. Forrest Gump was not built to be picked apart. It was built to be felt. Audiences cried during Jenny's death, laughed during the ping-pong triumphs, and sat in stunned silence during the Vietnam ambush that costs Bubba his life and reshapes Lieutenant Dan forever. Nobody in a theater in 1994 was pausing the frame to study a mirrored wall or a paddle grip. They were watching a man walk through the 20th century with a heart too big for the century's cruelty to fully break. The blooper, in other words, was never really hiding. It was simply irrelevant to what the film was actually doing to its audience. That is, in many ways, the deeper lesson buried inside this discovery. Continuity errors and anachronisms exist in nearly every film ever made, especially films built on this scale of ambition. Forrest Gump spans roughly 3 decades of American life, weaving a single fictional man through school integration in Alabama, the Vietnam War, the ping-pong diplomacy of the early 1970s, the Watergate scandal, the rise of Apple Computer, and the AIDS crisis that eventually claims Jenny's life. A production attempting to authentically render that much history, using both real archival material and constructed sets, was always going to leave behind small cracks where the seams show. What makes Forrest Gump remarkable is not that it avoided every crack. It is that so few people noticed them for so long, because the emotional architecture of the story was strong enough to carry the weight of minor imperfection without ever letting the illusion collapse. There is also something worth saying about why audiences respond so strongly when these small errors finally surface, decades after a film's release. It is not really about catching filmmakers in a mistake. It is about intimacy. Rewatching a beloved film closely enough to notice a reflection in a granite wall means loving that film enough to study its bones, not just its surface. Film scholars have long argued that the emotional impact of a movie like Forrest Gump comes precisely from its craftsmanship being invisible on a first viewing, so that emotion arrives before analysis. Only years later, once the story has already done its work on the heart, does the mind circle back to ask how the trick was performed. That circling back is not cynicism. It is a form of continued devotion to a film that shaped how millions of people understood grief, war, and the strange randomness of an ordinary life brushing up against extraordinary history. It is worth remembering, too, that Robert Zemeckis was no stranger to blending real historical footage with fictional storytelling in ways that pushed technology to its limits. His earlier work on the Back to the Future trilogy and his later work on films like Contact and Cast Away all reflect a director fascinated by the boundary between the world as it was and the world as cinema could reimagine it. Forrest Gump simply pushed that fascination further than any studio film had gone before, using then cutting-edge compositing techniques that would later influence an entire generation of visual effects artists. Composer Alan Silvestri's score and editor Arthur Schmidt's rhythm held the film's sprawling timeline together emotionally, giving the audience a through line even as the visuals leapt across decades. Within a production of that scope and ambition, a mirrored reflection catching the wrong decade, or a hand adjusting slightly on a paddle grip between cuts, becomes almost inevitable and almost forgivable. The production itself was a study in controlled chaos. Cinematographer Don Burgess had to match lighting conditions across archival clips shot decades apart with new footage filmed in the early 90s, a task that required constant improvisation on set. Costume designer Joanna Johnston had to age Forrest and Jenny convincingly across 30 years without ever making the transformation feel artificial, relying on subtle shifts in fabric, color, and silhouette rather than obvious markers of time. Meanwhile, the production design team, led by Rick Carter, rebuilt entire stretches of small-town Alabama and wartime Vietnam using practical sets blended with visual effects, often on tight schedules that left little room for the kind of exhaustive continuity checks a modern blockbuster might afford. Against that backdrop, a reflection catching the wrong year in a granite wall is not evidence of carelessness. It is evidence of just how much was being juggled at once, and how rarely it went wrong. What lingers, watching the film again with this knowledge in hand, is not disappointment. It is a kind of tenderness toward the human effort behind the illusion. Forrest Gump was made by people working with the technology and time constraints of the early 1990s, trying to build something emotionally true out of materials that could never be perfectly controlled. A real memorial wall will always reflect the real world standing in front of it. A real athlete's hands will always move slightly differently than an actor's. These are not failures of vision. They are the visible cost of ambition, the price paid for reaching further than the tools of the moment could fully guarantee. Perhaps that is the real reason this small decades-old blooper has resurfaced now, catching new attention among audiences who grew up quoting Forrest's box of chocolates and his simple, aching line about stupid being as stupid does. It is not because the mistake damages the film. It is because noticing it deepens the experience of watching something made by human hands rather than by flawless machinery. Forrest Gump endures not because it is technically perfect, but because it captured something true about hope, loss, and endurance so completely that even now, 30 years later, people are still looking closely enough to find the seams, and loving the film even more for having found them. In the end, the wall still stands in Washington, still catching whatever light and life pass before it, indifferent to the story it once helped tell, and somehow, that quiet indifference only makes the film's tenderness feel more real.